like I had a choice. If my parents sat me down and said, well, you're not going to be able to go to school anymore. Would you like to go to school or start your life as a married woman? I know I would have picked school. I just didn't think I had that choice.
At the age of 14, war erupted in Houry, Geudelekian's home country of Lebanon. Her parents, doing what they thought was best, had her marry a man 16 years her senior. For years, Houry has fought for gender equality, speaking out for other women until she found her voice, sharing her own story. Thank you for joining Lynne Foley, host of Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, as we hear from Houry about her journey.
One of the interesting things that I say sometimes is like, if I look back into my life, I see that every 7 years, it seems like something happened that completely turned my life around. So we can literally sit here, I'm 60 now, we can talk from the 7-year-old, 14-year-old, 21-year-old, 28-year-old perspective. But the reality is that my life did change completely at 14 in Beirut, Lebanon. As you said, I am Armenian, born to a first-generation immigrants in Lebanon. My grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide who ended up in an orphanage in Lebanon. And then my parents were first-generation Lebanese. And then by the time I was born, we were really well-to-do middle-class family that was enjoying all the wonderful diversity that Lebanon offered, right? We were neighbors with all kinds of people, religions. So that was a lovely way to grow up. But 1976 started a civil war that lasted about 20 years. And it really broke up my family completely. And it also was the precipice to really get me married off at that age, which was not something that happened regularly. It wasn't something that was traditional or in our culture or religion. It just was one of those odd situations that I was married. And luckily, it was with a person who was not, he was much older than me, but he was a very kind and generous and hardworking man and had a friend in New York City. So I think my life actually started when we ended up in New York City within a year, because there was a civil war. There was nothing we could do in Lebanon together. And I got to New York City at 15 and got my General Equivalency Diploma and started a life. I mean, when I think back now, and I mean, I don't know where the strength or the chutzpah was coming from, but I thought I could conquer the world. And I think that's one of the things about being young, when you're kind of fearless. And then, of course, I lived a fairly easy, well, I shouldn't say easy, it was not that easy, but it was a complicated life, but we achieved a lot together. Eventually, I had 3 boys and raised them right here in New York City. And it was really, at one point, I think it was about 30 years or 25 years into my marriage and successful business and a community leader, I started reflecting on where was my voice and where was my needs, how were they being met? And I started a journey of self-discovery, if you want to call it, and ended up really finding out that I had buried that 14-year-old girl's voice, who was brave, who was amazing, but was not able to really achieve all her goals. And the most important piece of all of this was the lack of education. To me, that was eating up on me. Like, I can't even begin to tell you. I was like, how can I, after all the successes I was having, the education piece was what was really eating up on me. So I was a straight A student, and I thought, I'll figure out a way to get back to school. I mean, nobody's going to stop me. I mean, there was no question in my head that I was going to continue my education. Yet again, the Civil War started right after I got married. And then when I got to New York City, I couldn't, we couldn't even figure out how to rent. We had no family here. We had one friend who employed my husband. So that was good. He was busy. He was at work 9 to 6. And I was left in the studio apartment that we figured out how to rent together with a sofa bed and a coffee table. And I would watch TV and just wonder, how am I going to figure out where are schools here? How do I register for school? And we didn't even have a green card yet. He had a working visa and I had an accompanying visa, is what it's called. And then, of course, there was a commercial that talked about GED, General Equivalency Diploma. Now, the good news is that I had a really good 8th grade education from Lebanon, because the education there is very advanced. I spoke English well, I wrote, obviously, and read very well. I spoke Arabic and Armenian and English. And then I took down a 1-800 number, called it. I think I paid like, I don't know, it was $19.99 or $29.95, one of those numbers that I charged on my credit card, and I get this booklet. And I figured out all by myself that GED was the equivalence of a high school diploma. And I'm like, okay, I don't even need to go to high school. I'll get my diploma. And sure enough, I did the tests in the book a couple of times. Took the subway, and of course there were all kinds of information. There's no internet, by the way. 1976, you can't Google anything.
No. Nothing.
But there was
television and newspaper, wasn't it? Radio,
exactly.
TV, newspapers, and journals, and the neighbours.
And I have to actually really thank the United States and New York City for having access, because this book had all the information, even numbers to call, where to take the test. And it was somewhere in the Bronx. And I asked people on how I get to the Bronx. It was the first time I took the subway, and I took the test and I passed it, because I took some tests, like the whatever, trials. So yeah, and then of course I was thinking, no, now that I have the high school diploma, I'll figure out how to get to college. But of course, that wasn't going to happen that easily and that fast, because we had to make money. So I started working.
I think I recall that your husband was a hairdresser, is that right? Yes. And so you went into that business?
I guess it's the immigrant story, right? And thanks to, because we were actually even scared. We were like, we don't know anything about business, but I don't know how. You call a number and then they tell you what to do. You call the real estate. I literally was the person that read all the contracts, dealt with the lawyers. I was the business part, and he was the creative part of the business. And then I became the manager, then became the public relation, the marketing expert. And then as our community grew, our status grew, I started getting involved with fundraising. I was not only working, but I was also in the community working through the schools of my children, and all the fancy people in New York City is how I call it.
What's your view on the importance of education from your life and what you see now, particularly for women and girls, and that link to gender equality and the pursuit of that? So I'm just interested in your perspectives there, Houry.
Absolutely. So I mean, like I said earlier, this has been, there's quite a few things that was wrong about me getting married so young, even though, as I said, I was lucky to have the privilege of having an opportunity to grow as a person while married so young, and became successful, right? So a lot of people, and whenever I would complain about not being able to go to school, people would say, well, why do you need education? You've achieved so much, what's more important? Sometimes there are people with PhDs who can't even get a job. There's that argument about, is education really what makes a person? And I understand that. I'm not saying that. I have come around to believe that I'm not less of a person because I didn't have the degree, but I know for a fact, and of course I had access to lots of reading. I educated myself as much as possible. I still remember on any day off, or on morning or an afternoon off, I would go to the New York City Public Library on Fifth Avenue. And the privilege of being able to walk in there and look at books and pull out books to read, or any topic that I was interested in. Most of the time it wasn't fashion or beauty, even though that's what I was making my money. There were so many things that I was interested in. It just felt so good to have that privilege. and partly because I felt like there are things that I probably don't know, even though I am successful, even though I am smart. I was able to talk to anybody under the table, as my family would say. I could argue because I read newspapers, I listened to the news, but that wasn't enough. There was something missing. I always felt like there was something missing in me. And that really took a long time for me to get over. And then, of course, finally, once my kids were all in school, I took it in my hands to start college. I think it was about 20 years ago now. And my youngest one was in elementary school, and Fordham University, we lived right next to Fordham University on 10th Avenue. If anybody's in New York City, they know what I'm talking about. And I remember I used to joke with my friends, I live on campus, because I was right next to the university and I would walk right in. And the joy that I felt taking credits, and I would do like 3 to 6 credits a semester. And I thought it was going to take me 20 years to finish. And it actually literally did take me almost 20 years to finish. And I finally got my degree a few years ago. But it wasn't because, it was because I was busy. I had a life, and but I just couldn't give up on it. I think just having that diploma, because of emotionally what it did to me growing up, was important to me.
So how do you now see that link between education and gender equality? Because in our world,
there are many families who would first send their sons, or make sure their sons are protected, and girls can always stay home and take care of the family, or feed, or clean, or find a job to support and take care of the elderly, right? I mean, and it starts as young as 12, 13-year-old girls taking care of either their older relatives or their younger siblings. And that right away is a perfect example of why we need to make sure, just because we're used to doing that, just because that has been acceptable, doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way, right? We have to make sure that we consciously educate families, societies, communities, and say, even if instinctively you know your child can handle it, just like my parents thought I'm such a smart aleck that I could handle it. So they gave me this responsibility. And yeah, not only I handled it, I mastered it, but that still is not okay. It took me years to recover personally, to find a voice that I have, that I can speak proudly right now. I could speak up for everybody else. I could speak up for my husband, for my children, for my family. I could speak up the rights of the genocide. I mean, I could speak up for everyone else, but it took me a long time, first of all, for me to admit to myself that what happened to me was not okay. And then that to also be able to share it with others, because there was also this guilt feeling of like, I don't want my parents or my husband to feel bad. I don't, because I know that they didn't intentionally hurt me. They thought this was the best solution. Well, it wasn't, because anytime you don't allow someone a choice, right? I mean, it wasn't a forced marriage, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. If my parents sat me down and said, well, you're not going to be able to go to school anymore. Would you like to go to school or start your life as a married woman? I know I would have picked school. I just didn't think I had that choice. I thought, well, I'm getting married now, but I'll go to school anyway. That's how much I had convinced myself that it was okay. So yeah, it's really important to educate about education, educate families about education.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that I find that having got to my years, somewhat older than you are, Houry, and back when I was 20, with a very different entry into life from yourself, I always believed that when I got to my age, we'd have fixed it all. What a silly belief I had at 20.
Wow.
But that, when I say fixed it all, somewhere in my mind I thought, well, you know, I'm a feminist, and I want the best for girls, and I want it to be, I want to have the best life. And like you, I don't know when I found my voice. I probably think I only found it 10 or 15 years ago, truly and really. And that thing about and this is probably not politically correct, but it's often in our minds, we sometimes marginalize ourselves because we don't actually believe that we can have that voice and that we are equal.
Yep.
I'm putting that on myself, not on anyone else. And then when we're also marginalized in society,
Absolutely.
in the way that we speak of, and I'm speaking generally about women and girls, not specifically,
Yeah.
it's a real double thing. It's like a double whammy, as we'd say here. And it's interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. You really hit it right on the nail, because, and part of the reason is because we are, I mean, I hate to say it, we are more capable. Women and girls are stronger. And I'm not talking about physically, of course, the testosterone, the muscles can probably lift a heavier rock than I can, right? But I think the fact that we can give birth, that we can nurture, that we can support. I mean, I've seen it even in my women friendships, right? The way we can actually rise to the occasion, the way we volunteer, the way we support each other is so different than the male instinct. It's an instinct that we have, right? And that because we have that strength, I feel like, anyway, my own opinion is that I feel like, well, I'm a survivor. I can do it. Like, I'm strong. It doesn't matter if my needs were not met at this level or the next level. I'll figure out a way to make it through. Because I could see how I was actually more confident than my husband, even though he had the creative aspect of the business, and he was older, he was more well-traveled, but there was insecurities in him that I felt like I need to cover up for and not worry about my own issues. So my issues were always pushed aside, and his needs were, and I've seen that this happen in so many households. And part of it is because I could convince myself to say, oh, you're strong enough, you'll get there, don't worry about it. And sure enough, I was strong enough and I did get there. I ended up having to do it by leaving, getting a divorce, and then really speaking up for other women until I was able to speak my own story. So when I started at NGO CSW, actually, I didn't tell my story until 5 years into my volunteering. After I heard so many other brave women speak up, I finally thought, okay, I can talk about this. And it's still kind of hard. It's still kind of new for me to be sitting here. And in my head, I'm thinking, I wonder how many people are going to hear this story and laugh at me or judge me or, or think that this is crazy. I mean, who would do something like this? But, you have to get past that, because to me, what's important is that I heard other women tell these stories that empowered me. And I'm hoping at least some part of my story will help and empower someone else to say, I'm ready to tell my story.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the work of the NGO CSW?
When I first got into this space, I remember feeling so little. First of all, I didn't have my degree yet. And I was coming from a beauty and fashion industry. And I thought, they're going to look down on me, like, who? Because that's so shallow. Like, I didn't even care about fashion and beauty by then, right? Why would they care what I think? And I remember at the time, Sun Young Yoon, who had just become chair, looked at me, and I don't know what she had done. I don't know if she had Googled me or she saw that I had some kind. She said, Houry, please do not put yourself down. Your experience of event organizing, fundraising, or even the way you think, because of your background, your like even the lack of education and your passion for education can really be useful in the group. And that really empowered me to speak up in meetings, for example, right? But then what happens is that over the years, so that started me into like saying, okay, and I would watch them and I would listen to everybody's advice. And then eventually, inevitably, just like Pamela Morgan usually in meetings goes, I hear you, Houry, but what about this, right? And then you bring all these mixture of ideas and you come up with a solution that couldn't be there without that collaboration, without that camaraderie, without that sisterhood, is what I would like to call. So the issue that I noticed, and it's important to address this, because just because we're all in the same space and we have the same ideas, I noticed that it doesn't mean that we all have the nature or the nurture of really being accepting of each other. And one of the biggest issues I've seen in this global feminist movement, and I'm so determined to keep working about bringing more partnerships and bringing more global feminist movements together, the way Zonta partners with NGO CSW. You know, it doesn't matter, like we're not in competition, because we're, like I said, our ultimate goal is that gender equality for all, right? How you go about it, how we go about it, and how we share the space together is what matters. But what I notice is that sometimes women and girls who have not had the opportunity to reflect and grow individually bring toxic masculinity and the notions of patriarchy into our space. And the first couple of times I noticed, I was like, wait a minute, these are our sisters. They have suffered just as much as I have for different reasons. Maybe they didn't have early marriage, but they had sexual assault or, you know, or whatever issues. Because 1 out of 3, remember, if we are 5 people in a room, there's going to be 1 or 2 who has a story that has affected her as a woman, right? So, but if we have not addressed it, if we have not looked into it deeply, personally, it will affect the collective. So it's really important to keep encouraging each other to grow on an individual level so that we can collectively grow together too. Now, what do we do about that toxic space? We have to address it. We can't just say, oh, it's just her, it's okay. You know, she's just that way. She just is negative all the time. Don't worry about it. Well, perhaps we can ignore 1 or 2 people, but I think addressing it collectively is really important. And with my executive committee team, what we have brought together to the table, and it's still work in progress. There's no way I can say that we have discovered the solution of global feminist movements and we're going to be perfect going forward. No, never, because that's not how humanity works. But one of the things that we've introduced, and I've noticed that it does help people, is when you think of it as a collaborative, transparent, shared leadership model. Because one of the things that happens and how patriarchy was even created, right, was because of power struggle. Patriarchy wants to diminish because they want the power. So if I disarm you by saying, well, we're equal anyway, like I'm not going to give you the power, we're going to have to share this power. And even if I'm the chair, the leader, I'm telling you, you're as equal as I am. I'm hoping to disarm that kind of patriarchy that we are bringing into the circle. Doesn't always work, but I am determined to keep trying.
And it's so important to do that. And through the organization that you're currently working in, there's power there of that collective and the power of connection and collaboration and all of those things. I'm just reminded of the saying, the behavior I walk past is the behavior I accept. And that mixes with the voice we were talking earlier and the calling it out that you speak about, you know, the power of the voice not to walk past things that we know are not right or they're not appropriate. And that takes courage. It takes all the things that we've been alluding to so far today. With that in mind, talk to me about leadership and the importance of leadership, because the underpinning theme in this, without using the word, is about leadership, self-leadership, leadership of others. So what do you think your powers and gifts are? And how do you use those in your work?
Being brave is one of the things that we have to accept, right? You have to be strong. You have to be, you have to have a resolve in your, like, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I have to say it. For me, waking up and knowing that the ultimate goal is gender equality for all, global gender equality. So everything I'm talking to you about, every step that I'm taking, decisions that I'm helping make with my community, with my executive committee, if it leads towards that, if it access to gender equality, then I'm not doing anything wrong. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from anybody. Now, how we get there needs to be as transparent and collaborative as possible. So we put the topics on the table. For example, this year, we shifted a lot into more advocacy than ever before. NGO-CSW has been known to collecting global women together, and we have conversation circles, we do parallel events, we do fabulous artisan fair, we have reception, we have wonderful events together, and we do advocacy as well. But for the past year, advocacy has emerged as the most important thing, because one of the things that I kept hearing people say is that it's great that we're gathered, it's great that we have an outcome document, but if we're not implementing, if we're not holding our governments accountable, it's like running in circles. So we keep talking about, yeah, this is important, but we're not really getting it done. So if that's the goal, then all topics that I put on the table for implementation accountability, yes, then we need advocacy. Doesn't matter how we get there. That's when you really allow all the voices to come into that table, let's say, and then make a decision on how to go forward. And if you see that it's a Babylon, or things are they're not really that, then you have to be brave enough to say, I hear you all, I thank you, and this is our final decision to move forward. So people are heard, though, right?
Yes, it's making sure that everyone has a voice, but in the end, who's the accountable person for the decision, who carries that forward, and where does the power of the decision lie, or the delegation of the decision lie? And that's that piece of all of us that somewhere in our lives we come to understand whether I currently have the power of the decision, or does the power of the decision live somewhere else, and when am I going to influence? And then when do I back away when I realise that I've had my go at influencing? I'm not able to change this outcome, but I've had a voice. But it's not I don't have the authority to make the decision in the end. I have the authority to influence. So it's a really interesting space once we come around to realising that, isn't it? And I think you've articulated that so very clearly. What do you do when your confidence takes a hit, or when your resilience is down? How do you work that through or recover? What's your go-to?
That is an excellent question too, because I'm not always optimistic. I am naturally an optimistic human being. I am naturally one that believes that if you keep smiling, joy will come, even through darkness. And because I have experienced so much darkness in my past, let's say from my grandparents, my parents, and I have found that, yes, definitely smiling and keeping an optimistic view helps. Yet, yes, I do have many moments, too many moments to mention. And of course, therapy and girlfriends and self-help books and Oprah and all of those things, they all help, right?
And listening to the stories of others and how they've overcome it. And that's why I asked that question, because people say, well, that really helps us to think about how we work through our own misfortunes or troubles or issues that confront us. Sometimes they might be micro and sometimes they're macro, and it's so important. So when you get some free time and when you're not terribly busy, what do you like to do? Because good leaders always look after themselves and look for things that sustain them. So what's one of your go-tos?
So one of my, and people have always said I'm so outgoing, I'm always busy, I'm always doing something. And every time they say things like that, I go, really? Because for me, the highlight of my day, week, month, even when I was raising 3 kids, I had 30 employees and had this huge social life. I always found moments of quiet. And I never understood what that was. I needed that to regenerate, right? But it is meditation. Even with therapy, friends, books, everything I told you, I think true discovery of myself at the end of the day has come from those quiet moments. The answers has always been inside me. It's when I'm not confident, it's when I'm scared, when I'm sad, feeling sorry for myself, that I forget that I have the answers. Now, it's not always easy to find that. And one of the things I have discovered is that just wait a day before you give up completely on this idea. Wait a day. And I usually advise my kids the same thing. I say, if it really looks horrible, just even if you can wait 2 hours, give yourself a couple of hours or a day usually. And I've always been shocked at how it gets resolved. I don't know how.
I think my line is, nothing's so terrible that I can't sleep on it, and it'll look better in the morning, because the sun will come up somewhere in the world and it'll look better in the morning. It's like, and sometimes it's true, or a lot of the time it's true. I have another little saying that says, get up, show up, and wear red lipstick. It's that case of, you were talking about optimism. So a final thought for people today, a final thought for me and everyone listening today, what might that be?
I love this one saying that has been driving me in my position right now. I think it's Fannie Lou Hamer said it. I don't know if she created it, but I heard her say it. She's the sharecropper that was a voting advocate in the 60s. And if anybody doesn't know about her, please Google her, Fannie Lou Hamer. And she's got this 1964 speech at the Democratic Convention that brings me to my knees all the time. She said, nobody's free until everybody is free. I'm not free. I'm not successful until everybody is. And I really do believe in that. I don't want to succeed for myself. I want to succeed for all of us. Whatever I can do to bring as many people as possible with me is what drives me. So that's the saying I want to leave with.
Houry, thank you. What a delightful conversation today. And thank you so much for your generosity and the power of your voice in what we've heard today. Go well, go safely into the next year and the work that you're doing with NGO CSW. And congratulations on that work. And thank you so much for sharing your powerful story today.